John, that was really fine. I'm a trumpet player myself and have some appreciation for how windy you have to be able to blow wind through that much brass. There's about 60 feet of brass there if you take it all apart and take the squiggles out of it, and it does take a lot of breath. And so thank you for giving us that gift this morning.
My pleasure.
All right. This is a tremendous passage that Doc just read. In that passage, Paul describes a contrast of the most dramatic kind, a stark and bewildering incongruity. Treasure in earthen vessels. It is not fitting that anyone should enclose a Rembrandt in a rickety frame, or place a priceless jade stone in a flimsy cardboard box, or a royal crown with diadems put in a case in a museum covered by dust. That would be all wrong, wouldn't it? Yet, this is what Paul sees precisely. This is what Paul believes and proclaims that God has done in Christ Jesus. There is this startling contrast. On one side, the magnificence of divine grace, for by grace are you saved through faith. And on the other side, there is the paltry human heart in which God's grace is lodged. Such an immense and shining splendor, the grace of God, the gospel of Jesus Christ, entrusted, deposited in, lodged in poor, pathetic, broken instruments. Humanity. Such an infallible truth as the gospel of Jesus Christ, that God so loved the world and gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him, such an amazing gospel, committed to such an ordinary church. We have this treasure in earthen vessels. It's terribly incongruent. In fact, from a human perspective, God might have gotten it all wrong. And yet it is God's idea. It is God's doing. So somehow it must be okay and right. Somewhere there must be a reason and a purpose for this shattering discrepancy, a jewel in a jar. Paul searches for that purpose until suddenly the purpose breaks upon him, luminous and undeniable, like in a flash of divine light. There is indeed a purpose for this great contrast, and it is this: to show the world that Christianity, with its many triumphs of faith in individual lives, that Christianity, with all of the victories of the gospel over life and death and despair and despondency, that Christianity and the forward march of the church, to show the world that Christianity cannot ever be accounted for by anything in and of humans. To show the world that the transforming power of the gospel cannot be explained by human skill, aptitude, power, or ability. For any such explanation that includes human ability is plainly ludicrous and absurd. Hence, it follows that the explanation for the endurance of the church and the power of the gospel must be given and placed squarely, firmly, and foreverly on God. We have this treasure in earthen vessels to show that the transcendent power belongs to God and not to us. Behold this morning the jewel of the gospel contained in the jar of humanity. Now let's look first this morning at these two opposing factors as they are contrasted in Paul's writing. the treasure and its common container, and then we'll be ready to think about this divine purpose that brings such opposite realities together. First, the treasure. Paul says there in verse 7 of the passage that was read, we have this treasure. That's Paul's valuation of the gospel. Is it ours? Is it your valuation of the gospel that it is a treasure? Or is it just a worn-out old story that you hear on Sunday when you come to church? Do we realize that this gospel, this old familiar story, even though it is familiar, it is still powerful and able to change lives? Even in the world of space travel and artificial intelligence, even in a world of prodigious wealth and incomparable technology, the most powerful force in history, Paul maintains, is this treasure, the gospel of Jesus Christ that has the power to transform us. Or do we look at Paul's declaration and say, well, that was for another time, another place, another person? Do we believe that in the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God without sin, Son of man to forgive sin, do we believe that that gospel is the only answer to humanity's calcified, greedy, yes, violent heart? So consider this question. What does the gospel and the faith it promotes offer to us? Well, the gospel comes to us one person at a time. That's part of its brilliance. It comes to one, for example, miserably aware that he has lost his grip on goodness, perhaps beginning to wonder if life is worth living. It comes to us such humans as we are and says, take courage now. Don't go down that path. Let me interrupt your cycle of destructive thinking. Here is God's renewal in the presence and the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That this story is part of your story, and you need to make your story part of God's good story. The future can be lighter and enlightened for you in light of the gospel. It comes to a woman weary of being objectified, ignored, and abused. And the gospel brings incredibly good tidings of great joy to her. The gospel of the Prince of Peace provides a new dimension of serenity that she otherwise would never know. The gospel comes to one who is crazed and confused and bewildered. He comes to this crazed and bewildered and chaotic world, so hungry for the truth. And it speaks good news, true news, transformative news. It remains a force in history of immeasurable range and application that can literally add a new dimension to the life and the history of this world like nothing else has ever done. No wonder the New Testament throbs with excitement from beginning to end. No wonder Paul stammers and clamors to find words to explain the power of this gospel. He talks about it in terms of unsearchable riches. He talks about the gospel as unspeakable gift. We have this treasure. This is great news for us. The treasure of the gospel, given freely, without strings attached. I mentioned earlier at the table about giving gifts and what an art form it is. How it shows our attitude toward life and toward others. I work with my students sometimes in chaplaincy about the gifts they have been given and whether or not there were strings attached to any gifts they ever received. And oh my, the conversations that slant on giftedness gives. God gave us this treasure of the gospel without strings attached. By grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It is the gift of God. it was this jewel, this treasure, that made Paul a missionary, you know. It was this treasure that drove him tirelessly across the earth, leading him to the great cities of his day. Always in Paul's soul, there was this deep driving impulse. I must declare this reality of the good news of Jesus Christ. Woe unto me if I preach not the gospel. We have this treasure. And now to gird our church with this truth. For our church to think about this truth, this gospel, this treasure, in light of our mission and our outreach. Do we need better techniques? Well, maybe. Do we need better space here at this church? Probably. But basically the need for us in this hour is surely this. A far deeper sense of the richness of the gospel that is given to us. A far livelier appropriation of the spiritual resources that are ours through Jesus Christ as resurrected Lord in this church. All the springs of our missionary powers and of our outreach are in three words, I think. Jesus, priceless treasure. Now consider the other side of this contrast. Turn from the treasure to the container. Turn from the jewel to the jar. The earthen vessel is in which the jewel is lodged. Well, take, for example, this Corinthian church. This is the second epistle to the Corinthians. You know, the church had a few problems, and Paul has to write to them twice. He actually had 5 or 6 contacts with them. We have 1 Corinthians as one of those, 2 Corinthians as the other. This Corinthian church, quite a situation. It was a heterogeneous handful of converted slaves, artisans, an unimpressive, impossible-looking lot, a mad, preposterous choice to spearhead a new campaign that would change the world. Not worth really a second thought in world history. Not worth really more than the dust under Caesar's chariot's wheels. And depositing the gospel here in this flimsy container called the Corinthian church must have seemed a colossal mistake. This was the chosen vessel, though, for the treasure of Jesus Christ. So too, I imagine, in our discouraged mood here, as we look for life and vitality in this church, we see its limitations, its boundaries, its limited resources. We see divisions unnecessary. We see our flaws and our blunders, our complacency, our uninspiring ordinariness. We're just like each other more than we want to admit. Just ordinary people. How can this place and this people really be the instrument for containing God's glory? Takes faith, doesn't it? Takes confidence. Confidence that what the world sees here is not all that's happening. But to go to a more personal level, Paul's sense of disparity in things was even more personal than corporate. Excuse me. He was evaluating himself as much as he was evaluating the church at Corinth. He was looking at himself when he lamented being an earthen vessel. In this very letter, the church expressed criticism of Paul, its founder. Can you imagine a church criticizing its pastor, its founding pastor? They said of Paul, his bodily presence is weak. He's kind of frail and weak, and his speech is contemptible. We expected an Olympian or Atlas of great strength, and we got a runt. We were expecting a polished rhetorician, but we got this plain speaking preacher with an uncouth accent. Quite put us off. Such was the incongruity that Corinth saw in the earthen vessel that was Paul the Apostle. But Paul knew even deeper than they did the great discrepancy that lived within him. It was not just his handicapped body and his broken health that was an earthen vessel. Not just the shabby figure and the provincial brogue. It was his soul within himself, that memory-haunted part of consciousness, sin-scarred creature that experienced there on the road to Damascus, new insights and truth about who he was and who he was not. What an earthen vessel. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Came the voice of the risen Christ. You are crucifying me afresh, putting me to an open shame, crushing the crown of thorns against my bleeding brow. But now with my head bleeding, Paul, and my heart breaking for you, I have come for you, Saul, my persecutor and my beloved son. And then that broken jar came to himself. Dear Jesus, divine and despised, royal and rejected, O miserable me, I am as much part of the problem as you are all of the answer. Against that piece of history, we look at ourselves and bring this verse, 2 Corinthians 4:7, bring this verse to ourselves. How is it that how is it that you can be an ambassador for such a royal Redeemer? Who am I to wear the name of Christ before the world? With all of my frailties, misgivings, doubts, who am I? Who am I to be a specimen and a sample of what the grace of Christ can do in a person's life? I'm an earthen vessel. But then I think of that great invitation hymn that we all grew up with. Just as I am, without one plea. But that thy blood was shed for me. If you haven't gone back and read all the verses to that great hymn, you need to do that. And keep this image of an earthen vessel in your mind. Just as I am. Now finally, let's consider this morning the purpose of this great paradox. It has a purpose. This incongruity that we're talking about, great treasure in earthen vessels, a jewel in a jar. It's an intended contrast. This treasure has been put into an earthen vessel not by mistake, but because nothing better was available. It has been put there deliberately by preference of a set purpose and intention. It is upon human weakness, not human strength, that God chooses to build His kingdom. Let me say that again. It is on human weakness, not on human strength, that God chooses to build God's kingdom. This seems to me to be exceptionally good news. Very polished, startling good news. Is it not a great thing to know that God can use us? Not merely in spite of our disqualifying traits, but precisely because of our disqualifying traits. We confess that in our vanity there is danger. The danger is that we should put our trust in our own ability, our own efficiency, our own agency, as though the church were to be sufficient for God, rather than God being sufficient for the church. That is conversion in the life of a church. To give up on the notion that we would ever be enough for God, and to fall on our knees and say, God, you are only and always enough for us. There is danger in that vanity, but there is life in that conversion. The fact we must recognize and reckon with is that the church's strength is never going to be equal to the task. I spent a lot of my time early in the ministry thinking what is wrong with the church, that they just can't get it together and be equal to the mission that God has called us to carry out. That was certainly immature of me. The church's strength is never going to be equal to the task, whether it's the Great Commandment or the Great Commission. And I've come to thank God for that. To thank God for that. The very fact that there is such a frightening disparity is the hidden secret of the church's power. God forbid that we should be misled and duped by the naive supposition that when the church blossoms, when the church becomes great, when the church begins imposing its will upon the earth, that the kingdom of God is near. If God's kingdom is not of this world, then a self-sufficient church would be ultimate heresy. Because a self-sufficient church needs no faith in the power of the gospel. Oh, to confess that God can use the church best when it stops aiming at prosperity and prestige, stops being infected by the world's ideas of what constitutes success and greatness, stops wanting to be strong as the world counts strong, hoping to use that faith strength to construct anything of eternal value, that God can use the church best when by a great act of faith it will offer to Him precisely its weakness, its feebleness, its ordinariness, its helplessness, and saying, Lord, take this earthen vessel and let the world see the excellency of the power of your gospel apart from and in spite of the fragility of who we are. Now, the more I think about this verse, and I've been captivated by it now for 2 or 3 months, the more I think about this verse and its truth, the greater the thrill in my heart. We are so apt to think dejectedly, oh, God can't use me. It's obvious I'm not smart enough, I'm not gifted enough, I'm not talented enough, I'm not spiritual enough. There are days when my heart is as cold as a dead log. There are days when my mind cannot even think about God. Get someone else, Lord, get someone else. But if this word in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 is true, we must not ever say that. For do you not see? Do you not understand? Can you not get a glimpse this morning to feel how your weakness can be for God's purpose? Do you not feel, and can you not come to entertain the notion that your fragility is only the opportunity for God's strength? God has promised to make His presence known through the most broken, fragile, earthen vessels. That's why the contrast, the incongruity, the paradox. It is precisely our felt weakness, our self-distrust. is precisely the baffling motivations that are inside all of us, to which this creative promise of grace is given. To show to the world, to broadcast and shine a light so the world can see the transparent, transformative power of God belongs in the gospel. And we are just tires that carry the air. Now, one last thing. We have this earthen vessel. I went to one of my good friend's funerals yesterday over in the Brownsville. Ed Matthews, been a missionary, chaplain. I couldn't help but think of this verse while I was sitting there in that beautiful church, that we have this treasure in earthen vessels. I've heard from those who've been to Israel, I've never been to Israel, but I've heard from those who have been there, that out in the countrysides and the rural areas of Palestine, you can just walk down the road and see broken pieces of pottery and clay earthen vessels that have accumulated over the centuries and over the millenniums. And if you dig down, the farther you dig down, a lot of these archaeological sites, they dig down, they find these broken pots, shards of these broken pots. And they put them back together, and you know what they find? Archaeologists, they get into that, kind of like putting a puzzle back together or something like that. They find that these pots were very common. Just as common as the rocks in Palestine. And they find when they put them together that they came in all different shapes and sizes. But you know one thing about a pot that carries a jewel? The jewel is only exposed when the pot is broken.